I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
The magic is helping companies understand how to implement processes that are gonna just be a win-win for everyone. How to not fall into traps of, cumbersome processes that hold companies back, but at the same time, make sure that our technology is actually effective, right? And doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Does not have hallucinations, right? Does not miss out on some of our target audience because it's discriminatory. I would encourage investors to help their portfolio companies figure out how to do that.
That's Ravit Dotan, an advisor and researcher on AI governance based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I caught up with Ravit to get a handle on the new state of play for responsible AI in the early days of the Trump administration, and what Deepseek, the Chinese competitor, means for intellectual property, open source code, and national security. Let's jump right in. I'm delighted to have Ravit Dotan, an AI governance expert and researcher. Welcome, Ravit.
Hi, David.
Ravit, this week, I guess, is the Deepseek week, and where it sort of burst upon at least the market's consciousness. I think researchers have been thinking about it for a little bit. But obviously, it had market implications for some of the big AI players. But tell us a little bit about what you think the sort of policy and ethical and responsible AI implications are.
Yeah, there are a lot of implications to the Deepseek saga that is kind of unfolding before our eyes. One of the most prominent aspects is IP and copyright. OpenAI says they have evidence that DeepSeek has trained on outputs of their model, and they're saying actually this violates our terms and conditions, right?
That's a little bit rich in that everybody thought OpenAI was doing exactly the same thing, no?
Exactly. That's the irony of it all. That OpenAI has been accused, for a long time to have used inappropriately other organizations' IP. Of course, it's used that IP in a different way. The way that it's accused of doing that is through scraping, right? So OpenAI says that it only used publicly available data, but then some people are saying, well, but you haven't used it in the way it was intended, right? So there are lawsuits and all of that. What OpenAI says that DeepSeek has done is a little different, right? It's not exactly scraping. So the accusation is that they use a technique where they take outputs of the model itself, of OpenAI's model, and use that to train DeepSeek. So it's a slightly different accusation, but the underlying discomfort is the same, using IP in a way that is not intended.
What about the other sort of IP issues? I think DeepSeek is open source, and that means that anybody can access the source code, and I suppose build their own versions. I think Meta, if I am not mistaken, also had open source their code, but that's been one of the sort of fault lines, I think, in the AI debate. What does it mean that now something like DeepSeek is open source?
Yeah. So I would add, I think the three major fault lines around the DeepSeek story. First is the IP copyright. Second is the open source or not. And the third is the geopolitical relationships or tensions, I should say, between U.S. slash Western countries and China. So I would like to also get to the geopolitical relationship. But yeah, open source debate has been ongoing for a long time. So just for people who might not, be proficient, in that jargon. So the question is whether code should be available for everyone to utilize for their own purposes or not. So some code is like that, and you can find it online in various places. And you can just kind of take parts and utilize it in your own projects. And a lot of companies use that. Commercial companies are going to take parts of what is called foundation models because they are available online, and they're just going to embed that in their own code and use it. So that's what is called open source. OpenAI used to be open source at the beginning, but then it changed its mind. So if you'd like to incorporate code, the model that OpenAI uses, you're going to have to pay them. So it's not open source. You can't see under the hood in that sense.
You mentioned the geopolitical implications, and obviously the U.S. and China competition over AI has been upended in a certain way. But more broadly, what does it mean if sort of anybody can get very powerful AI, whether that's bad actors of all sorts or governments and anybody?
That is exactly the heart of the open source debate. On the one hand, people are saying, well, this is actually very powerful technology. It should not be available for anyone to use for any reason, right? There are huge concerns. We're even seeing that models that are just kind of out there online are not necessarily used for positive purposes, starting from just generating pornography or asking about how to create dangerous weapons. There is much less oversight, if at all, when using those open source models. So that's the concern, on one side of the map. But the concern of the other side of the map is that if it's not open source, well, then it's huge power in the hands of the only ones who can use it, right? How can we understand how it works? How can we build guardrails if you don't really have access to the heart of it? So that's the back and forth of the open source debate, where in the background there's huge financial consequences too, right? So a part of OpenAI's income and all the companies that have not open source is via companies buying access to their models. If it's open source, then yes, it could harm their income. So there's a huge economic rationale kind of behind the scenes, and kind of thinking of the geopolitical impacts as well, right? Where are the servers? Where is the data? In addition to various privacy issues that people are concerned with, there's also, data is power. Where the data servers are is power. And so if there's processing, using another country's servers, then, that kind of comes into the mix. Although if it's used as an open source code, that it can run on any server anywhere.
So people have been saying, that everybody rushed to download DeepSeek and immediately started, telling it their deepest secrets and trying to use the tools. It makes the TikTok debate over control of information look like kind of the kiddie playground, no?
It's exactly, yeah, it's exactly the same kind of concern, right? I don't know even how to compare, right? Because it's apples and oranges. With something like TikTok, where you have videos, then you literally give them your face, you literally give them your voice. What is more dangerous? I don't know, right? What they do with the data, I do not know. Of course, same could be said about Western services, and I think that is a point that people sometimes miss out on, because a lot of the services that we have in the US, such as OpenAI, such as Gemini, they are taking data for training. What are they doing with the data, right? It could have harmful ramifications as well. And I think that is somehow swallowed because of this competition between US and China.
Now, as an old tech reporter, sort of struck me as inevitable. Whether exactly how it might develop was unknown, but the fact that the technology would get out there, that it would be broadly available, that it would get more and more powerful, that the chips would become more and more efficient, if not the software become more efficient, is just the way technology has worked for decades now. And I think that the Trump administration, in terms of rescinding some of the earlier orders, has sort of signaled like game on, like this is what they, in a sense, were ready for or wanted to see. So, is there any role or for government regulation or guardrails? I mean, where does is there any way to put the genie back in the bottle?
Yeah, okay. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding when it comes to the impact of the changes with the Trump administration. He did indeed, rescinded Biden's executive order, which was very much focused on trustworthy AI. But it's not as if he's saying, let's cancel all of that, because in the same well, I haven't seen the order itself. I've just seen the summary. I don't know if the order itself is up yet, but in the summary of the order, it's very explicitly um, ties back to Trump executive order from, I think it was 2019 or 2020, but from his previous term. He himself, Trump, had an executive order on AI. In fact, he was the first. And he has a pretty explicit section there about safe and trustworthy AI. So these are terms that he himself is using. And also in the summary of the new executive order, in which he rescinds Biden's, he refers back not only to this executive order in which there is a section, he also refers to an initiative that he started, in the previous term, which also has an emphasis on trustworthy and safe AI. So it doesn't seem like, everything is just out the door. To me, it seems more like, this is my personal assessment, he may have just a different version of AI ethics or responsible AI, trustworthy AI, but it's still there. In addition, Trump also had in his previous term executive orders targeting specifically, the company behind TikTok. So if we're judging based on what he did in his previous term, it would appear that the topics are on his mind, that he is thinking about regulatory tools related to it.
And so, whether it's Trump or Biden for that matter, what can be done when the technology is moving ahead so fast, the regulations are slow to catch up, and it's not really clear, how any of it would be enforced or really written into the code in the first place.
I think first and foremost, focusing on existing laws. Because AI is a new technology, I think there's a tendency to think that we need new laws for it, and sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. And there's a lot of room in understanding how the existing, parts of our legal system already apply to it. And so it starts from privacy issues, consumer protection issues, non-discrimination issues. There's a lot that can already be done, and we've seen in the U.S. specifically enforcement agencies already using those existing laws. So that's already there for us. It's meant to protect us. Why not use it?
Okay, well, if it's not as different under the new Trump administration as it had been under Biden, why are folks like Mark Andreessen, why had they gotten so exercised against Biden's AI policies, and why were they so excited, frankly, for the Trump administration to reverse them?
Yeah, okay. So I do think it's different. It is different, but it's not as if trustworthy AI is a concept that's going to be non existent within the Trump administration. Um, I think there's a perception of guardrails as something that is going to stifle innovation. And I can see where he's coming from. But I think that the real concern is not from the concept of trustworthy AI or responsible AI, but rather from the processes that are conceived as kind of the necessary way to do it, right? We're seeing in companies a lot of the times processes that are very cumbersome, right? That are very weighty on the company's work. And I think that really that is the thing, if anything is stifling innovation, it's these kind of processes, right? Like having to submit for approval for reviews. This is, I think that is my personal perspective. I think this is the thing that is perceived as stifling. But I think that trick is not trick, but the magic is understanding how you actually have better innovation with trustworthy AI. It's true that sometimes when we design processes, they hold us back, but that's really more about process design more than about AI safety or trustworthiness. And I think that at the end of the day, it is pushing innovation forward, right? If you understand how to develop your AI properly, it is just going to work better for you, the company, for your stakeholders, for society at large. But you have to design those processes, right, in an informed way that's not going to hold you back. And I think that that's where the conflation is coming from, because I think a lot of companies, the processes end up being such that they feel as if it's a hindrance. And I think that, in my opinion, that's where a lot of the hesitance is coming from.
What can investors, and particularly sort of responsible investors or impact investors, do to kind of push this forward? I think last year got a little bit of attention when Omidyar Network and the Ford Foundation and I think the Nathan Cummings Foundation made what it turned out to be quite a small, in the scheme of things, investment in Anthropic. But the point was to kind of have responsible investors have a seat at the table, or at least have somebody to return their phone call when they raised questions about worker voice in the implementation of AI, or some of these bias questions or other kinds of things that are coming up. Is there any way that investors can influence the development?
Definitely. To investors, I would say first and foremost, let's learn from the ESG movement, right? Because we've seen that there are ways to promote agendas of this kind that can create backlash. And that's what we don't want, right? So that's the first thing that I would say to investors. Let's learn from the past, right? How we want to do it in a way that's not going to be misconstrued as something different than this actually is. Um, and maybe going back to the previous point, I think the magic is helping companies understand how to implement processes that are gonna just be a win-win for everyone, right? How to not fall into traps of, cumbersome processes that hold companies back, but at the same time, make sure that our technology is actually effective, right? And doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Does not have hallucinations, right? Does not miss out on some of our target audience because it's discriminatory, right? I would encourage investors to help their portfolio companies figure out how to do that.
And in that context, there's part of the, at least the rhetoric, if not the text of the executive orders, was somehow rooting out woke ideologies or DEI or other things from AI models. I mean, A, is that a concern, and B, is that a code word for actually implementing some other kind of ideology in the AI? And is that something that really government is in a position to even arbitrate?
You know, that's a fantastic question. And I think we're gonna find out. I think it's one of those things that we can't um, really know in advance. And I can see companies just responding in, a big variety of ways, right? There might be companies who might be, maybe they weren't bought in to this work to begin with. So this is going to be a great opportunity for them to kind of, you know, remove these activities. Or, I mean, we've seen Meta removing, some content moderation that they had before. Of course, I don't know why they did it. I mean, they didn't think it was a good fit for them, I guess. But yeah, so we might see some companies removing some of these practices. We might see some companies keeping everything the same, just calling it a little differently or like packaging it a little differently. And I don't yet know. I don't yet know how it's gonna go.
So, final question, Ravit: Are you a tech utopian and AI is gonna save the world, or are you a doomer and it's gonna end the world?
You know, I'm I'm in between. I think that the main problem is the hype on both sides. And I think that as long as we're focused on the hype, we're missing out on the actual opportunities and the actual risks that are involved. And I think that that is the thing that concerns me the most, that when we are attracted to these extremes, we're missing out on the real shifts that are going on in society right now.
Well, Ravit, there's going to be many such shifts, and we're going to come back to you if you're willing to help us make sense of them. So, thank you very much, Ravit Dotan.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Thanks to Ravit and to our producer, Isaac Silk, and to the whole team at Impact Alpha, investment news for a sustainable edge. And to all of you, Agents of Impact, thanks again for all that you do.